Hi, welcome. In today's episode, you get to hear from Rohini Ross. Rohini is a friend, a colleague, and most recently, my guide, which you're going to hear about in the episode. She and her husband, Angus, are the Rewilders, and they work with couples on relationship in any stage of the relationship. And they do one on one retreats with them, as well as some coaching and support. Rohini also mentors other coaches and practitioners, and they are both just incredible human beings. They have a podcast that I want to give a shout out to that is really amazing, and we'll put a link to that in the show notes. And they're working on season 2, but season 1 is completed, and it's a really creative way in which they work with a couple in real time. So you get to hear that, and then they reflect on the sessions with you, the listener. So, in today's conversation, Rohini shares her personal journey and evolution through traditional therapy and then coaching, and then how her coaching and work with people has evolved. And most recently, what she's seeing and offering people. And I've been a recipient of that. So, you're going to hear about that as well. But really, just to say, it's how do we move through our life and our work more open hearted? How do we resist what's happening and learn to trust the unfolding, learn to trust what is? And also, you're going to hear us talk about the coping patterns that we have, and me especially, you're going to hear about, but the coping pattern of rushing to our mind, and really the invitation and what's possible if we can see that and really just get present to what is, to the feeling body, to the sensation, to what we might be wanting to avoid, what's possible when we meet it with love and compassion in the moment. So, without further ado, here's our conversation. As always, I'm so grateful to have you here. Thank you for listening. Hello, hello. I'm so glad you're here. Thank you for taking time to speak today. I can't wait to just dive in. Thank
Oh,
you.
you're welcome. And I love speaking with you, Barb. And thanks so much for having me.
Yeah, I think where I'll just start is I was just lucky enough at the beginning of the year to do a one-on-one immersion with you, an intensive. And it is not an understatement for me to say that it has had a profound impact in the way in my feeling level and what I've been seeing for myself since our time together. And, like you, I can't help anytime I start to wake up to something new or get inspired, not want to share it with other people. And so I really invited you here because I think there's something really rich and beautiful and unique, or unique maybe to me, but unique in what you're seeing and how you're pointing people. And so I wanted to speak into that. That's kind of the intent here. But also because we're friends and colleagues and have known each other for a long time now. I know that you've made a journey from, like, your desire has always been to help people.
Mhm.
And so you were a therapist, and then you transitioned into coaching, which is right around the time we met. And then your coaching has evolved over the years. And so I'd love to just start with that and share a little bit about that evolution, because I know people listening are at all different stages around their own self-development, their personal development, but also around the resources they're looking for in their life. So I think there just be a lot of richness in that direction.
Okay. Well, that evolution, I think the evolution and the form that my work takes has very much been a result of my own shifts and grounding and insights. And so as those have unfolded, things have unfolded in my work. So I knew that, like you said, I wanted to be of service to others. I wanted to help people. I felt really drawn to that. And so therapy felt like a route to go that would be a structure that I could learn from and develop mastery in. And one of the things that really felt helpful for me was the fact that you were required to get 3,000 hours of client hours in order to even get a license. And so knowing myself, that kind of structure was helpful for me to get those 3,000 hours in. And other people like, oh, that's crazy, 3,000 hours. I'm like, oh, that's a great way to get really a lot of hours, and I'll have support the whole time. So I'm really glad that I did that. And I don't know that I ever really saw myself as practicing as a therapist for my career, but it was a great training ground in that regard. And, as my sort of own grounding has shifted over the years, I think when I started my therapy practice, I was always looking to how someone can experience their authentic self, their true nature more deeply. I think that I had, because of my training, a lot of psychological layers that were the way to access that, right? So did a lot of gestalt work, a lot of emotional release work, and there was absolutely incredible value in the vulnerability of that, in the ability to meet ourselves. But I didn't have the as much of a direct experience of my authentic self as I have now. And so I think those shifts have really impacted the sort of the simplicity that I see now versus then. I think I could feel that I was going in the right direction, but it's kind of like walking through the forest, not quite sure which path to take. And but sort of very intuitively following it and seeing results with clients. But then I started to get burnt out. I was working at a company where it was like on call. I was on call 24/7, and I didn't really know how to take care of myself in that environment. And I thought, well, maybe I don't want to be a therapist. Maybe I can't serve others in this way. What else? And at that time, which is, gosh, like 2010, 2011, like way long time ago now, everyone was starting to talk about coaching, and a lot of people I knew were doing coaching. And I thought, oh, well, maybe I want to look at coaching. Maybe that's different than what I'm doing. And so I started a coaching program. And then I met George and Linda Pransky, who you know through that program. And that was where I really got impacted by the understanding of the principles, which for me was really life-changing in terms of having a greater clarity about what I was up against. I had a real blind spot that had it be really hard for me to see that what I was up against, like I thought I was up against my anxiety, my insecurity, and that I needed to fix those. And what I got from working with George and Linda was a real experiential knowing of there was nothing wrong with me and there was nothing that needed to be fixed. And I may have had less anxiety and insecurity, but it really didn't matter. Like that was the freedom. And that was such a huge shift in my work because I thought I was up against my anxiety, my insecurity, and that I needed to improve those. Of course, that would be what I would be pointing others towards as well. And so when I saw that, oh, there's wrong, there's simply experience that is unfolding, that is always for us, that is always our innate health expressing itself in the best way it can in that moment, then all of my resistance to that shifted. And that was the freedom. And so I think that helped me get much more clear in terms of my work and helping people really see more clearly how they were resisting their experience, and that was creating suffering.
Yeah, I would love to just stick with that for a moment and do a little bit deeper dive there. Because obviously, and it's a similar, while I wasn't a therapist, I was inside of
Mm-hmm.
companies. I did teach personal development also, and it was based on kind of some of that Gestalt work as well. So I can relate to that, that view of ourselves that was sort of checking boxes of, I'm okay with this part of myself, and all these things are things I have to work on, right? And yet to really come across the principles, which just also for somebody that might not know what we're talking about, is it's an understanding of the mind and the role that thought plays in creating our moment to moment experience, our internal experience, as well as an understanding of who we are beyond experience, who we are beyond thought, beyond behavior. And that combined understanding also for me was really transformative and revolutionary. So when you talk about we're just having an experience, and so you're using your insecurity or your anxiety as an example, can you talk a little bit more about that, what that means?
Well, it meant that I'll talk about my own experience. It meant that I was spending a lot of time and energy, one, resisting my experience and looking for strategies and techniques as ways to try and change my experience so that it would be more comfortable or preferable to me. And it was exhausting and it led to a lot of disappointment because I felt like my worth was connected to feeling a certain way. So I knew that my worth wasn't connected to money or these things, but I really did think my worth was connected to how I felt, and that if I was feeling insecure, unworthy, that meant that I was like that meant there was something wrong with me. And the freedom was in seeing that this is experience that's moving through me. Yes, it's coming from thinking that I'm having, that I'm identifying with, and I'm having an emotional experience that reflects that. But I don't have to do anything with that. Like, that was the freedom, because I thought I needed to do something with that experience. And then being able to just see that, oh, that's just my fear of being open to what is. As that fear fell away or settled more, I got to experience more of not just anxiety and insecurity, but more of all of my experience. So the range of my experience, I was able to enjoy the full range of my human experience with much more gratitude, grace, and ease. And the fluidity of it, I would find myself less caught up in specific experiences because it was much more fluid. And I was, even if I was caught up in it, I got much less scared by it. Like, I was really scared of my experience and I didn't realize that. And so rather than trying to change it, I just needed to see that, oh, there's nothing to be afraid of here. And so that's where Angus and I came up with the rewilding idea, is to be rewilded by our experience and to be rewilded back to our natural state, which allows us to experience not just our thoughts and feelings, but who we are deeper to our thoughts and feelings, and to be rewilded by that love, compassion, all of those qualities that are beyond sort of just the changing emotions that flow through us. And so that freedom within me helped me then see, well, I can point others to not being afraid of their experience as well. And there can be sort of the celebration of the aliveness of what it is to be human, including all of the feelings that we don't like, as well as all of the ones we do. But in that opening up to it, there is something that just comes through that helps us to clear up our misunderstandings. That helps us to shift out of our conditioning in a way that gives us a greater experience of freedom and liberation. And so that just that's interesting to me, right? So that just is like, oh wow, because it feels like that's infinite, and it's always like every moment is that, right? There's no way to not have that be what's here right now. Like, am I present? Probably not. I'm caught up. It's like, what happens when I actually allow myself to open to what is more fully?
Yeah. Yeah, I think, and, you know, in our time together in January and since, I'll just share that I had been paying attention to or noticing my behavior, right? It's
Mm-hmm.
kind of what I came, one of the things I brought to our time together. And it looked like and felt like, and you can speak into this, Rohini, so I don't put words in your mouth. But for me, it was like I kept thinking, I'm in some kind of pattern and it's a problem. Like, just sincerely, it is a problem. I could feel that I was like, it wasn't fresh. It was something familiar. It felt like, some idea of something. Like, there was enough awareness around it, but I did feel in a way like I didn't articulate it this way, but kind of a victim of it, like a victim of myself almost, right? And this conditioning that you're talking about. But you really helped me see that while that may be what's happening, I'm trying to fix the pattern. And what you were pointing me to is, I think, what you're speaking to now. It's like, no, no, no. The pattern is a symptom of you avoiding what life is offering you in that moment. Like the pattern is sort of the symptom of something versus the thing that needs to be addressed. And so, could you speak to that a little bit more?
Yeah. So the patterns can often look problematic, right? That we have behaviors that are habits that we don't like. But if we really look at those behaviors, we can see that there are coping mechanisms that are protecting us, right? That they feel comfortable and they do protect us from the feelings that we're afraid of. So this isn't your pattern, but let's say someone has obsessive thinking. Well, that can feel really uncomfortable and feel problematic. But if you really look at it, that obsessive thinking is actually a way to not feel what's going on in the present moment. Because if you're in your mind like that, you're identifying with thought and you're not really present to the felt experience, or you're present to a small window of it. And that felt experience is really the direction to look in, because the coping mechanism, the habit, is there as a way to try and help us feel safe, to try and help us not feel the deeper feelings that can feel more overwhelming and more vulnerable, even though often how we feel with the habit is not great. So I'm not saying we feel great. Someone who's got obsessive thinking is probably feeling uncomfortable with that, but that feels safer than really letting go into the unknown, into what else is really there. And so, as you're saying, rather than look at the behavior that looks like it's the problem that needs to be fixed, it's really turning around and saying, well, what else is present that behavior is, and looking at trying to fix that behavior is actually having you not be present to what's really alive and wants to be met. And I think that's something that is so important to recognize, that the deeper feelings of vulnerability that can feel overwhelming when we're young, it is overwhelming to feel those feelings by ourselves. We're not able to handle the intensity of our emotional experience when we're alone as children, especially young children. But as adults, we have the capacity to fully feel our experience and be safe. And yet there's a legacy of not wanting to go there, believing that it is still unsafe to do that. And so we can dip our toe in and lean in and have support, like you're saying, to actually go there and to realize our capacity to be with all of ourselves and to step into the mystery of what that actually is, to be with all of ourselves, because our intellect can only comprehend what's conceptual, but we're not conceptual. We're real and alive. And so to be able to use that more vulnerable emotional space as a way to access a deeper experience of the fullness of who we are, I think is profoundly healing, and very similar to how I was saying doing my work at the beginning, but also very different, because there's a simplicity with which I hold it now, where I think previously, when I first started as a therapist, I didn't have as much trust in the unfolding of that deeper intelligence within us. It felt like there was more that I needed to do, more that I needed to know, and that I was more needed to do more than I realize now for my clients, which is what is the source of burnout really at the time. And being able to trust that everything is inside of you, everything is inside of every single one of us, and that is the source of our awakening, our healing, our shifts in consciousness. And I can be of service as someone who points in that direction, who hopefully creates a safe container for that exploration. But there's actually very little for me to do, because you do it, or whoever I'm working with is the person that's having the courage and the willingness to have a deeper experience of who they are, and willing to, if necessary, be uncomfortable in that process, but not uncomfortable because our authentic self is uncomfortable, but because of all of the misunderstandings that we have that can feel really uncomfortable, that often have to be sort of experienced and brought in out of the blind spot into awareness in order to have them dissolve and to really see like, oh, this is it. It's pretty simple.
Yeah, it's really so I wanna a couple of questions are coming to mind,
Mhm.
but, just to help people sort of see it for themselves in what you're saying, that, as you said, all of us have as when we're younger, and I know that, trauma is something we're all talking about, and that's a spectrum, right? There's all sorts of trauma. What is trauma there? But what I hear and what you're saying is that something happens to us as children and to our minds don't have the capacity to make sense of it. So what it does is the intelligence of the mind helps us cope. And for many of us, I don't, it's we go to our thinking. Like
Mhm.
somehow we go into the mind because the feeling body just it feels overwhelming or
Yeah.
scary or
Yeah.
uncomfortable.
Yeah.
And so then we grow up and in a culture that then also, respects the thinking mind a lot. That skill, that piece of us can get, really sharpened, right? It becomes even more ingrained. And what you're really saying is we also want to build the capacity to meet the feeling part of us, to allow that feeling, to be with it fully in our full presence so it can move through us. How would you add to that, Rohini, and what I'm
I
saying?
thought you said it beautifully. The coping mechanism often for people is their intellect. And it feels safer, even though I think ultimately it's really uncomfortable, but it can feel safer to live in a way where we identify with our thinking. We believe our thoughts are real. They are what are important. They're what are valuable. And it becomes a habit to hang out there rather than to open to sensory and emotional experience. And that sensory and emotional experience, when we recognize the fluidity of that and the safety of that, there's a freedom and liberation in that that allows us to not suffer in the way that the mind creates suffering for us. And it doesn't mean we don't have thoughts, but we don't identify with them in the same way. And we can use our intellectual capacities in ways that are useful rather than in ways that are harmful to ourselves. And judgment, I think, is one of the most painful ways that we use our cognitive ability, is to judge ourselves and decide that we're worthless because of XYZ rather than experiencing what's true. And truth is a direct experience. It's not a cognitive or conceptual understanding. We can't understand truth. It's a mystery. It's never going to be understood by the intellect. But there's experience that is available to us that helps us orient to truth and to what is real.
And that piece of truth and what's real, what's the value in that? Like, you know what I'm saying? Like, in a way, what does that have to do with anything? Like, in regard to, I just want to have a good life. I want to do work that's meaningful. I want to have good relationships. I want to make the money to support my life and the people I care about. Can you, like, what does any of that have to do with that?
On one level, nothing. It'd be lovely to say, "Oh, well, that means you're gonna make this amount of," it doesn't mean anything.
Yeah,
Or
yeah.
you're never gonna get divorced. Like, it doesn't mean any of that. But I can say, let's look at the area of relationships where Angus and I work a lot. So often, not always, but often people are coming to us because they're actually struggling in their relationship and they want to have a different experience in their relationship, or maybe not even be in their relationship. When we're working with them or when we're talking with them about the work, we're explaining to them that we're not here to fix your relationship. Like, that isn't the way that we are going to be approaching this. And this may not be for you. But the way that we approach it is that we support you with having a deeper connection with your innate well being, with who you are, with your true nature. And through that experience, you will access your common sense and wisdom and have clarity about what choices you want to make in life. And so that impacts relationships, right? It doesn't mean the relationship's going to stay together, but it allows people to live the fullest expression of who they are, which might include marriage, it might include not being married, it might include making lots of money, it might include not making a ton of money, like, but the fullest expression of who we are, and then the chips fall where they fall, I think, in the world of form. But for me, the the greatest gift feels like the freedom and liberation from suffering. And how is that connected to my bank account? I don't really know, but I enjoy having less suffering in my life with whatever's in my bank account, right? And this is where I don't know how it works, but it does feel like the more free I feel, the more I have that joy for life and love of living, that just things fall into place very gracefully in beautiful ways. But I don't know, like maybe that's not going to happen tomorrow. Who knows, right?
Yeah, but I appreciate what you're saying. I think that, in a way, I remember when I was, first really learning about our inner landscape and the role that it has in shaping experience, but also in our ability to bring, our full self to whatever we want to do, our full creativity, our expression, whatever that might be. And I would often get told by some of, our mentors, like, you could slow down, Barb, you could slow down even more internally, right? Or, what's the feeling you're living in? And I remember sort of not respecting that because I was like, my feeling's fine. Like I'm fine. I'm, like people, life is good. And I have some goals and some things I want to achieve. And it wasn't because I didn't appreciate what you're really saying, that, oh, in a freer, more present, freer, responding more in the moment, we actually have access to the things we're looking for when we're trying to, manage our personality or manage our drive, that it's all that direction, all when overused, I'll say, like you said, creates burnout. But for me, also just like that constant pressure around that it's all on me. I got to perform, I got to
Yeah.
get my personality in order. And that kind of vigilance was like I was a fish to water. Wasn't complaining about it, right? It just looked
Right.
like that's the way you create things. But then to really see like there is a whole nother way to be creative and to be connected and to experience more love and well-being. And its direction is what you said earlier, internal.
Yeah.
And that really becomes then like new ground for new fruit to, what's the fruit that comes from that versus Barb's effort and will.
Exactly. Like being the vessel, allowing
Yeah.
yourself to be used for that expression of unconditional love, infinite intelligence, God, the divine, however you want to label that. Being the vehicle to express that into this experience of form and to not have to guide it. I mean, I'll speak for myself, to trust. I think for me, one of the learnings or something that's shifted for me is really moving deeper into recognition that I can trust this unfolding, that I don't need to control it because there's a deeper unfolding that I might never understand, but that I can enjoy. And in the trusting of it, like you're saying, there's less pressure, there's less contraction around it, and so more openness and surrender to what is. And the deeper that surrender is experienced for me, the more beautiful life feels, even with the challenges that come up on the living level. We lost. Am I
Yeah. Can
back?
you
I think we
start
lost.
over
Okay.
with, yeah.
Sorry.
And
I don't
just
know.
start, that's okay.
I
Just
think
start
maybe.
over with and even if you remember what you were
Do
saying.
you remember what I was
Yeah.
saying before the end? Even. Oh, and even with the challenges that life brings forward, like at the beginning of the year. I mean, Barb, you are so blessed with grace. Literally, the day you left was the day the fire started in LA. I mean, goodness, that was. I mean, we were very fortunate that our home wasn't impacted. We just needed to be evacuated, but it was challenging on the logistical, practical level to navigate that. And it's also very practical to be present and open and in the flow. Like everything was such an amazing series of synchronicities in terms of how things unfolded. We had 2 intensives during that time that obviously couldn't happen in Topanga, and everything, like, we were ready to postpone or cancel whatever we needed to do, but there was just such a beautiful synchronicity in how everything unfolded, and we couldn't have made that happen. It was really in the surrender and trusting that whatever's meant to be is going to unfold here. We certainly don't know what that is. And it's like, wow, this couldn't have worked out better. We couldn't have figured that out.
Yeah. Yeah, and I think, two things come to mind. One is when we talk about suffering, I know I kind of had an aversion to that word because I'm like, I'm not really suffering. Suffering is like way more extreme, but to really realize that we're talking about the internal suffering of, overthinking or burnout or just not being happy with what is. And I think that piece around it is it. It's like, when we resist what is or we're unhappy with it, that creates a whole series of things inside of us that create extra potential suffering. And you're that example of, the fires and the intensives and, all of that is a really good example. And I'm wondering if you could speak to, yeah, that piece around the resisting what is. Because for me, that's often when I start going into fix it mode.
Yeah.
And so the invitation that you offered me in January is one of the invitations you offered me to really look at what is from a different place. Can you talk about that, Rohini?
Yeah, and you can let me know if this is on track in terms of what
Yeah.
you're pointing to. But I want to comment first on what you were saying about the suffering piece, because I think that we are taught to be strong. We are taught to be, to push through. We are taught to function over the feedback that our bodies are giving us, that our emotions give us. And so we become desensitized to our internal suffering, and it becomes normal, like, oh, this is normal, I'm okay. And I can absolutely relate to that, because I was exactly the same. Like, I'm fine, but I wasn't fine. I just didn't know I wasn't fine. Like, because of the release of pressure, that felt good to me, and now I'd be like, oh my god, that's not fine. But that's, I think, important for people to understand, that as health arises within us, we become more sensitive, not less sensitive. We are more available to the feedback that our emotions are giving us, that our senses give us, that our physical bodies give us, that we become less capable of functioning over that feedback. And that's really helpful, because it lets us know how we're doing. And it lets us realize when things really aren't working or in service for us. So that, and I don't know much about mental toughness, but when I hear words like mental toughness, it's like, oh, that feels painful, that feels hard. And this feels so much more welcoming for our humanity, and to have the ability to have compassion and kindness for our humanity. And I think this links to what you were asking me about, is the different vantage point is from a vantage point of not resisting what is, and actually being able to be present to what is. And that means waking up to all of the ways that we resist what is. And I'm sure I have my blind spots still regarding that's infinite in many ways, but that there's these subtle ways that we try to find comfort, where we go to our habitual patterns, which may not be as obvious as, drinking or doing drugs, but are going to our mind to find the answers, or going to worry, or going to, distraction that feels more comfortable than actually feeling what is. And I have so much compassion for how scary it can feel to just be present. Like, it sounds really simple. It's like, what's the big deal? But we have this learned response that can be really strong. And especially, like you're saying, people have had different life experiences that can make it feel less and less safe to actually be present with what is. And this is not about ignoring that, minimizing that, diminishing that, but fundamentally being present to what is what allows us to access who we are. I don't know another way, right? Like that just seems to be the way. And sometimes we need support on that journey. I've needed support. You've got support. It's like there's nothing wrong with that. But to me, that really is the direction that's available for all of us. And it's the melting of those layers of resistance that allows us to really fully open to who we are and the fullness of that.
Yeah, yeah, I think that's really beautiful. And it's when you start to become aware of all the activity that's happening in our mind as a result of not being willing to just accept or feel what is and what's arrived in that moment. And I think in case it's helpful, I can share a couple. But, as you know, one of the situations that brought me back to St. Louis was my mom falling, and she's doing great. But after she started to heal, I was on the track of finding my new home, and it's time to go back to Asheville. And then I could feel that I was forcing something. And so just being willing to say, wait a minute, what if you didn't force it? Then I could hear a deeper truth that
Mm-hmm.
was not yet, stay around. So then that was great. But even then, to watch myself still feel like the home situation has to be resolved, rather than completely, and I have moments in and out of it, but I think it's just such a simple way where it's like, oh yeah, what if there's not a problem?
Yeah.
I'm just having to navigate that it's not what I expected.
Yeah.
But how do I just, rather than constantly rushing to my mind to problem solve it, if I just meet the day to day experiences that happen as a result of that?
Yeah. And that's such a great example where we go to this needs to be resolved in our mind as a way to not be present with what's really going on. Because often we're not, you're not feeling good in that moment. And it's like that's what comes to mind. Angus talks about like, oh, we hang our hat on that. Like we hang our upset on that. And it's like we have our things that we hang our upset on, but it's not that. But we can then go into our mind and think about the thing that we think it is. And all of that is a way of not being present with what's really going on and in the moment. And these habits are often so invisible. I still totally get caught up in these habits, but the more visible they become, the more able I am to just be with what is, the easier things get. And the pain that gets created often, like if I'm hanging my upset on Angus and his forgetfulness or something like that, if I think that's a problem, then we're probably going to end up having a conversation that isn't great for rapport and kindness and love in our relationship. Like it creates not just suffering in me, then I act in ways that create suffering for somebody else. And there's that ripple effect. And when we bring it back the other way, when I'm able to be with my own fear, my own insecurity, whatever pain is arising within me in that moment, rather than blaming him or someone else, it's like then that doesn't happen. And I actually meet what needs to get met, which is wanting to be met with love and compassion within myself. And that's what we're capable of. We're capable of meeting these vulnerable parts of ourselves in a way that meets those emotional needs. Ultimately has the misunderstandings that are the source of the upset be able to be seen for what they are. And we can ultimately get free from those misunderstandings so we don't have to keep getting upset about those kinds of things.
Yeah. So, can you give guidance on people who are listening that might be like, oh, is my problem jumping to my mind? They're resonating with the thought that maybe there's something to just be met and felt versus solved, right?
Mhm.
And so what would you recommend for people to just lean into this a little bit more, to see something? What do they do in those moments?
Well, if there's awareness, I think that's the key piece, is to start to be aware of how we're using our mind. Are we using our mind in a way that is creating suffering for ourselves, or are we allowing our awareness to point us into the present moment? So the noticing is really the first step. And, how do we get present? Like, it's like, I don't know. It's like we just get present. We notice. Like, we can use techniques to get present. There's loads of mindfulness techniques. It's really what works for each person to get into the present moment. I know for myself, body sensation is one of the ways that I start to bring myself into the present moment. Breath is another way that I might notice my breathing and focus on my breath. So, I mean, these are all very common meditation techniques that can help us to just get here now. But the technique does not have the power in it. Like, we can use a technique in a way that we make that a habit. And so anything that becomes a habit is not being present. So that's where it gets a little tricky. But whatever works, I went to our community since the fires. There's been wonderful community gatherings in person in our community. And last night, somebody facilitated a community singing. And so I went to that, and it was just so much fun, and the feeling was wonderful. And I realized, I was just really present. Right. And so singing was an entry point, and singing with others. So there's not one way, but we can find the ways that we enjoy. But if I'm in upset, that emotional cue lets me know that I'm in distress, and that if my mind is going to things external, that's not going to help me. And I want to come back to, what am I feeling? Just be curious. Like, maybe curiosity is to get curious about what's happening internally rather than what's going on externally. But again, not curious in the way of I need to fix my experience, because that's what I would have done in the past, but just curious to be with experience, having an open mind and an open heart to experience, not to change it, not to fix it, but to allow it the space that it needs to move through. And there's wisdom in that comes forward. There's understanding in that. There's knowing in that is helpful, that just arises.
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah, and I think it feels, potentially it feels elusive to people, but I really appreciate that we want to be cautious of a formula here, because then often we're using the mind to navigate something. And what the invitation really is to meet the moment. And
Yeah.
I like curiosity. I think that's what works for me. It's not that the mind is silent, that we're not it's not, it's there in it. But I think for everybody to get their own felt experience around this is where the real key is.
Mm.
So what in those moments of noticing, that's a moment of awakening. That's a moment of a shift of consciousness. That is already something is happening just in that moment. And then, yeah, as you and I have laughed, my tendency then is, all right, let's conquer this. Let's do this. And so it takes a little bit from me to have to, like, not turn everything into, something, and just to be quiet and sit. And I think that's the piece, that there's so much wisdom, insight, richness in that direction, and just the presence to what that sensation is. The mind is going to want to diagnose and interpret and take you on a story. But what's been interesting for me is to not follow where the mind wants to go,
Mm.
but to just build my capacity, cultivate my ability to just sit in the sensation. And you're right, we can't, in that moment, something happens, right? We can't guarantee it, but something happens. And often, some of the things I think we see is, one, we can handle it. Like, so we get better at that full range that you spoke to,
Mm.
easier. And then as we step in it, we're doing it different other than the conditioned habit. But again, if I'm trying to make that happen, it's just, again, I'm in my mind about it versus just kind of meeting it. And hopefully that, I just want to encourage listeners, if this is like, what, just to hang in there, that if something has sparked inside of you around what Rohini's been sharing, what we've been talking about, to let that have room, to let
Yeah.
that kind of wake you up and trust that something is being seen.
I love that. And the exploration can be like, what is it to have an open heart and an open mind? Like the curiosity, not necessarily when we're in the middle of upset, but just as a general orientation. And I think for myself, I notice sooner when my heart starts to close, when my mind starts to close. I'm able to be aware of that more often than I was previously. And I'm better able to be with that experience rather than trying to manage it or change it.
Yeah, that's great. Well, Rohini, as always, I enjoy being with you and sharing conversation. I just want to give you an opportunity. Is there anything that's present in this moment that you'd love to share before we bring everything to a close?
Thank you. I think that's what I just said, is that curiosity about what it is to have an open heart. There was a phrase that came up in an intensive that Angus and I did, that I just kind of it just came out and the client just loved it. But it's the open heart is the healer, and I just love that. It's like our open heart. That's all it is, and we're sensitive, and it's so easy to feel like we need to protect ourselves and close our heart. But ultimately, the capacity to have an open heart, that is the healer.
Yeah, that's beautiful. I love it. Let's, I think that's a perfect place to end. Thank you. On the show notes page, we'll have links to you, but is there any place in particular that you want to encourage people if they want to find out more about you and Angus?
Probably the best place is our website, therewilders.com.
Yeah, great. Well, thank you, Rohini. So appreciate you and the amazing work you do and the impact you've had in my own life, both as a friend and as a guide. Thank you.
Thank you, Barb. So grateful.
As always, thank you for tuning in. If you enjoyed this podcast, it would mean a lot to us if you could take a moment to first subscribe and follow wherever you like to listen to podcasts. Hitting the follow button means you'll never miss a show. All you have to do is hit the plus sign in the upper right-hand corner or click on follow. While you're there, if you like what you're hearing, we'd appreciate you taking a moment to give us a shout out and review. Most importantly, however, if you know anyone that would benefit from this episode, please pass it along. And finally, if you'd like to learn more about my work, Innerverse Academy, or upcoming events, you can check out my website at barbarapatterson.com. You'll find some great resources, classes, and videos, and a lot more. Thank you again for being here. See you next time.